Peter Lippman up next.
Yes, thank you and welcome, Sanada. Good morning, good afternoon, Scotland. So happy to be on this panel. I'll just start right into it. With respect to Bosnia, my attention over the last 2.5 decades has largely been focused on the efforts of ordinary people and grassroots leaders to recover from the effects of the war. So today I'll talk about post-war grassroots human rights campaigns. Now, during the war, over half of the more than 4 million citizens of Bosnia were made refugees or displaced internally. By the end of the ethnic homogenization of territories controlled by 3 different ethno-nationalist groupings was pretty near complete. At least 500,000 housing units had been destroyed, and after the war, the economy was operating at somewhere around 20% of its pre-war level. These were conditions that people had to recover from. In their efforts to recover, they have been helped somewhat by the Dayton Agreement, which of course helped bring the war to an end. But the Dayton structure, as defined by Bosnia's constitution in Annex 4, has significantly hindered the functioning of a state that should help ordinary people live in peace and thrive in their work. The Dayton structure has closed off so many routes to this goal that it's channeled political and economic developments in the country to the exclusive benefit of the wartime separatists and profiteers. Dayton allowed those people and their political errors to become the new elite in the country. So people have been compelled to struggle with the Dayton system in order to achieve a measure of justice and equality. I'll try to illustrate that dance between activism and obstruction. In this context, I identify 3 centers of power that could help to bring about change in Bosnia or prevent it. I've already mentioned the first, that being the neglected but essential grassroots, which brings about change from below. The second center of power is that of the domestic leaders who overwhelmingly work to maintain a system that benefits only themselves and some cronies and relatives, leaving ordinary people in an ever-worsening material situation. Corruption is the essential practice of most of these leaders. In this capacity, they pose all sorts of obstacles to change and recovery. The third center of power is the international community, by which I mean the primarily Western states that choose to be involved in the recovery of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Their representatives implement the will of those home countries through the prism of Dayton, for better and sometimes, and often for worse. They tend to deal with the political leaders, no matter how corrupt they are, without paying enough attention to the initiatives of ordinary people. It's clear that for there to be constructive change in Bosnia, the international community will have to work harder to bolster the effects of the grassroots, and ordinary people of Bosnia will have to go over the heads of their corrupt leaders to make change. Now, the Dayton Agreement defines the people of Bosnia as members of constituent nations, that is, as members of one of the 3 main ethnicities, rather than simply as citizens. So people are forced to identify themselves and to behave in the political arena as embedded members of an ethno-religious community rather than as individual citizens. This artificial division, first of all, enables Bosnia's politicians to continue to manipulate their constituencies through the use of hate speech and warmed-over wartime rhetoric. Of course, these tactics are used in different proportions among the 3 different ethnic leaderships, but I'm not able to take time to elaborate on that difference of scale now. With their control of the media and well-developed propaganda techniques, they've proved very effective in reinforcing their entrenched positions and in keeping ordinary people separated by ethnicity. This is a situation in which solidarity and progress in human rights struggles are thwarted in very concrete ways. The separation of communities in Bosnia prevents people whose identities may be much broader than their ethnic background from forming bonds across ethnic lines with people that they have a lot in common with. One example of the division is the maintenance of separate school systems. In the Croat and Bosniak-run federation, there's the grotesque Jim Crow system called 2 schools under 1 roof, where members of the 2 ethnicities are taught in separate classes in the same buildings. and the Serb-controlled Republika Srpska has worked to adopt the school curriculum of neighboring Serbia whole cloth. All this works to the detriment of coexistence and understanding among fellow Bosnians. Now I want to give a brief history of some of the responses of ordinary people to the state of their country after the war. The first central human rights campaign was necessarily the drive for refugee return. Given the terrible conditions in Bosnia immediately after the war, a lot of displaced people chose to stay where they had ended up. However, a significant number of people wanted to go back to their ancestral homes. So by the thousands, people formed local organizations that agitated for the right for return. These groups then combined to form regional associations that were then, in turn, united under at least one nationwide umbrella group, the Coalition for Return. Through this network, people shared information on many of the problems of return, how to fill out applications, what the deadlines were to submit them, what periodic changes were in property laws, and how to visit their pre-war homes. They took risks to visit the cemeteries in their pre-war communities and eventually to clear the rubble from their devastated houses. In the first 5 odd years after the war, returnees were often met with violence amounting to a kind of low-intensity terrorism. Rebuilt houses were torched or bombed, and assassinations took place as well. And in addition to violent obstruction, even more effective means of obstruction to return was of a bureaucratic nature, obstruction at the office counter. There, people were confronted with daunting forms to fill out, exorbitant fees, and instructions to go to yet another obscure local government agency to get some different form. People were kicked around like a ball, as one would-be returnee told me. Only the most persistent were able to succeed. So when they were confronted by obstruction from local authorities, activists carried on, demonstrated in front of international offices, and sometimes blocked roads. In various ways, they compelled international officials to pay attention to them. One of the leaders in the movement for return was Vahid Kanlic, who had been a social worker in Gorazde before the war. He had lived in the industrial suburb of Kopači, which was taken over during the war by Serb separatist forces. That place is now, therefore, located immediately on the other side of the inter-entity borderline from Gorazde. Mr. Kanlic described to me how he accompanied 2 busloads of displaced people to Kopači one day in April of 1996. They wanted to visit the cemetery, but they were blocked by hundreds of Serb civilians and dozens of policemen. Snipers watched from the roofs. Kanlic and his people retreated. Despite such threats, all around the country, displaced people persisted in their efforts to return home. In a few years after the war, return activists in many parts of Bosnia started to erect tent encampments in their pre-war communities, or as close as they could safely get to them. In late 1999, the displaced people of Kopači set up a tent encampment on the inter-entity borderline from where they could see their pre-war homes. This tactic, along with others, bore fruit, and by the next year they were starting to return home. Soon I was able to visit Vahid Kanlic at home in Kopači, where all was peaceful. Similar campaigns met with notable success in the Zvornik region, also around Doboj, Mostar, and Prijedor municipalities, among others. By 2000 and 2001, there was return to every municipality in the country. However, in some places it was only minimal symbolic return, but in others it approached 50% of the pre-war population. Then, when people returned, they were subjected to all kinds of discrimination and intimidation, including random and punitive inspections and taxes, extortionary utility hookup fees, infrastructure neglect, and attacks on rebuilt places of worship. So it became necessary to campaign against discrimination, in which in some places bordered on apartheid. This campaign is still ongoing, necessarily. Meanwhile, there was a parallel, multifaceted struggle that has often been called the Campaign for Truth and Justice. People called for the apprehension and prosecution of war criminals, for the location of hidden mass graves, for the exhumation and identification of their missing loved ones, for the establishment of memorial cemeteries such as the one at Potocari near Srebrenica, and for other crucial forms of memorialization. Among these were the thwarted campaign to create a memorial at the notorious former concentration camp Eromarska near Prijedor, and the ongoing campaign to remember the 102 children who were killed in that same municipality during the war. There's been official resistance to this campaign, but it's made some headway as time goes on. Furthermore, from the beginning, there's been distortion of wartime history in a variety of forms, such as blaming the victims, denying the fact of genocide, and not just in Srebrenica, justifying the wartime aggression, and outright lying about this history. In response to this distortion and denial, both in Bosnia and abroad, people have worked to refute the assertions of the atrocity deniers. Preserving the record of truth remains an integral part of the campaign for human rights in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've described some of the work now done by grassroots activists in their campaigns and the progress that they made in spite of obstruction to that work. Now, Dayton didn't say that displaced people couldn't return, quite the contrary. In Annex 7 of the agreement, it called explicitly for a return and freedom of movement. But at the same time, Dayton enshrined the wartime division of territory by formalizing the two ethnically controlled administrative units established during the war. These entities provided a bulwark against return. In the same way, the maintenance of an ethno-nationalist political structure, as enabled by Dayton, also perpetuated corruption and ensured ethnic division and ongoing obstruction of memorialization. But as a little counterweight to my criticism of Dayton, one thoughtful activist in Prijedor recently said, "The Dayton Agreement is a negative thing only to the extent that we use it as an excuse not to do anything at all. This is a good illustration of the steadfastness of an activist." As to the role of the international community in Bosnia's recovery, international agencies poured in $5 billion for reconstruction in the first 5 years after the war. For a time, successive high representatives exercised fairly robust power in response to obstruction and wielded leverage to keep local authorities from perpetrating violence and furthering separatist goals. Then, around 15 years ago, the international community backed off and promoted a strategy that it called local ownership. That is, allowing domestic officials to repair and restore Bosnia-Herzegovina on their own. But I would ask, how effective is it to leave the foxes to guard the chicken coop? It didn't take much time for it to become clear that this strategy was not succeeding. It's true that officials of the international community regularly level detailed criticisms at Bosnia's domestic leadership. These criticisms focus on the problems caused by Bosnia's corrupt officials and on their failure to follow through on promises to reform and move toward assimilation in the Euro-Atlantic alliance. Such pronouncements by international officials are so regular and accurate, but with no resulting action, that it seems as though the internationals think that their only real job is to issue criticisms on a declarative level. The West has long since lost its rudder where helping to guide Bosnia forward is concerned. It's been distracted, of course, by dangerous conflicts further afield and by internal tensions as well. But ignoring Bosnia and leaving it to its own devices not only leaves the country's conflicts to fester, but it leaves Bosnia open to continued political intervention from its neighbors, Croatia and Serbia, as well as from Russia. Croatia and Serbia have not given up on their interventionary habits stemming from the 1990s. Their meddling in Bosnian affairs is very dangerous. Now to come up to date a bit about human rights campaigns. In recent years, there has been a complication because of the exodus of thousands of Bosnian citizens to Europe. They are not just looking for jobs, but for real stability under governments that exist to help their constituencies thrive. At the cost of leaving their homeland, people are opting to live in states that are not run by a kleptocracy. And campaigns come in waves. It's not unusual for people to move on and phase out of activism. Some leaders get married and start a family. Others become co-opted by NGO work, and some even go into politics. But new generations of activists arrive. Ordinary Bosnians have continued to organize because the conditions that make people unhappy have not changed. In 2014, a near uprising took place in many cities, primarily in the Muslim-dominated towns in the Federation. In addition to sustained and angry demonstrations, hundreds of ordinary people gathered in plenums from Tuzla to Sarajevo to Mostar to express their grievances. It all started with a worker protest in Tuzla and spread widely, really shaking up the establishment. Under duress, some of the corrupt politicians even fled their homes for a while. But showing some confusion about the meaning of the uprising, the High Representative discussed the option of sending in troops to restore order. It was a low point in the history of international understanding of problems in Bosnia. The 2014 rebellion did not lead to great changes, but it contributed to the political culture of the grassroots. Obstacles posed by ethnic division and obstruction are formidable, but there are signs that Bosnian activists are increasingly collaborating across ethnic boundaries. For example, in recent years, they've organized protests against street violence. These actions were in response to two mysterious killings in Sarajevo and Banja Luka. This kind of violence has been a disturbing and uniting factor for many years in the post-war period. It doesn't sound like a political issue, but people understand public safety and the inaction or even collusion of the police and judiciary to be a very political thing. The incidents of violence that I've mentioned anchored people and mobilized them to protest. Collaboration on this problem developed across entity lines, with people traveling between Banja Luka and several Federation cities to participate in the protests and support each other. In other recent activist campaigns, people have continued to agitate for memorialization. They've rolled up their sleeves and participated in flood relief, and in recent months, worked to help some of the desperate migrants from Africa and in the Middle East in places where they've been stranded in Bosnia. I'll wrap up by saying a little about what the international community could do better. For starters, it should use its neglected but formidable economic and political leverage to put a stop to the profiteering, divisiveness, and separation that have reigned in Bosnia-Herzegovina, especially in the last 15 years. There are many measures the international community can take. It should finally address the problem of the judiciary and prosecutorial sectors, which are overwhelmingly in the pocket of the political parties. International officials can make it harder for politicians to engage in corrupt practices and foment hatred by instituting sanctions and travel bans, freezing assets, and withholding aid. These things have worked before. On the positive side, international officials can support cooperation across ethnic boundaries and between municipalities. They should support independent media and always an endangered category. They should work to sort out the wretched educational system. And finally, there are many grassroots organizations, clear-thinking local leaders, and some helpful non-governmental organizations that the international community should encourage and support materially. The role of these activists has to be recognized as essential to the healing and recovery of the country. So the international community should give greater voice to human rights organizations such as the Youth Initiative for Human Rights, the Center for Nonviolent Action, for gay rights organizations, women's rights organizations, and many more. Thank you very much.